Well, Pearl Harbor happened right when I was in high school in 1942, and so we knew as soon as that happened that we were all going in the service. And so sure enough, when we all graduated in June, we registered for the draft, and when your time came up, you signed it and you left. And a few months later, I was gone. And Fort Leavenworth, then to Miami Beach, Florida for basic training, and then to Flight Engineer School up in Goldsboro, North Carolina, then back to Florida for aerial gunnery training. Then we crewed up in Shreveport, Louisiana, and for a couple of months, getting used to each other on the crew and what have you. And then we went to Norfolk, Virginia. It was supposed to pick up airplanes and fly overseas. Well, at that time, Martin's at Baltimore was on strike, and we didn't get any new airplanes. So they took 6 crews of us and put us on cargo ships in Norfolk, Virginia, 300-ship convoy. We were on there 21 days, zigzagging across the ocean until we got to North Africa. And then we finally got to North Africa. About a week later, we ended up in Sardinia, and that's when I started flying. That was in July of 1944. And we were heavily involved in the wars in Italy after Rome was freed, and a lot of bomb missions in northern Italy, and then the invasion of southern France, which you don't hear much about. But that was a huge, huge battles. And the Germans had a lot of artillery all the way from Marseille to Toulon to Bordeaux. So we were heavily involved in railroad yards, troop concentrations, ammo dumps, anything we could to help with the invasion. Finally got it done in the middle of August of 1944. I think it was over 5 days before my 20th birthday. I remember that. And then we moved up into France as the troops took over into Dijon. And so I spent the rest of my time in Dijon. And as the governor mentioned, on my 42nd mission, we got hit pretty hard, losing fuel, and the pilot told us that it looks like we're not going to make it back. And so we threw everything out of the airplane we could except our parachute. And when it got to where we just had a few minutes left, we saw this strip down there, an old Luftwaffe strip. And the pilot said, "I'm going to try." And he got it down, and we got it on it and blew both tires, but we didn't have any fuel, so we didn't have to worry about a fire. And we got out of the airplane. We didn't know where we were. We thought we'd probably end up being prisoners. And the Germans had pulled out 5 days before, so it was back in French control. So we were really pleased, and we stayed with a Monsieur and Madame Valiant family for 18 days. We spent Christmas and New Year's with them, and before we could get back to, there wasn't any way for us to get back to our unit because everything was going east to take over the Rhine River. So we spent 18 days with the Valiants, and finally got back to our unit, and had to fly again, and flew 18 more, and finally was done. I got to come home, and I sailed from England on VE Day, 9th of May, 1945. I thought I'd probably have to go to the Pacific, and I had a brother flying off of carriers, a Navy pilot in the Pacific. I thought sure I'd go over there and join him, but when I went through Fort Leavenworth, they said, "Do you want out?" And I said, "Well, yeah, I want out." While we were on board ship going to the States, the point system came out, and the one that had the most points got out first because we didn't need like 7, 8 million people anymore there. And so, make a long story short, I said, "Yeah, I want out." The next day I was out, and took my B-4 bag and went down, caught a Greyhound bus, and went to St. Joe, and I remember that very well. Got out, got in a streetcar and went home, and I was home for good. And I was the first one in St. Joe that got out on the point system, and so my picture was on the front page of News and Press. And interesting, when Colonel Burton Logan started the Air Guard in St. Joe, 2 years later, he remembered my picture on that front page as an enlisted man. And he called me and recruited me and wanted me to be the first sergeant of his unit he was starting, because he wanted a combat veteran and so on, and I had that. So that's how my Guard's career started, St. Joe at that time, and then 2 years later we were called up. I was commissioned that time. 2 years later we called up and went to France for 2 more years during the Korean War, and came back, and then I started my Guard career at Lambert Field in St. Louis. While I was down there, we called up again and went to France during the Berlin Wall crisis when Kennedy was president and so on. And we spent a year there and came home. And then in 1971, when there was a vacancy here in Jefferson City, Colonel Logan, the commander up at St. Joe, had brought me in the Guard, and General Du Bois down at St. Louis, who I'd worked for 18 years, called the AG and said, "We want you to interview this gentleman. We've been training him for 24 years for this job." And so I never will forget, it was 2 days before Christmas in 1970. I came up, had an interview with General Adams, and he said, "Okay, I'll talk to you later." Time I got back home, he had called General Du Bois and said that I've selected him for this job in Jeff City. So I went home and told my wife and kids that we're moving to Jeff City. And that was one of the better things that ever happened in my life. I was fortunate under General Adams, and then I was really fortunate to have him 14 years under General Kiefner, who was one of the top AGs in the country and set all kinds of records for the Guard, and I got to be with him for 14 years. Marvelous experience.
You, I'm sure, have a lot of ribbons and a lot of metal that you can hang on your uniform. Where does this rank?
It's pretty hard, but right up there. I have a shadow box with all my medals in now, and I'll definitely fit that in there, and that's quite a nice honor. I knew it was in my file, but you know, that was 67 years ago, and things don't always happen. But no, I was quite pleased and quite honored today that something like this would happen. And,
I was interested in talking to guys who would climb on these planes because, you know, in World War II, I mean, these were kind of new, kind of experimental type things, weren't they? I mean, you know, why did you see the Air Corps and because you weren't a pilot, you were just.
I was a top turret gunner. Strange. When I went through the draft.
Why would you do that?
I went through the draft at Fort Leonard Wood, or at Fort Leavenworth. And the day before I went in, everybody went in the Navy. The day I went in, everybody went in the Air Force. And the day after me, everybody went in the Army. It's just the spaces opened up in basic training. That's how I ended up.
2 questions for you. First, how old are you?